Sorry for being incompetent, everyone. Welcome to the final panel for today's conference. I think our theme today is flow. So I'm just going to introduce very briefly our two wonderful panelists. So first we're going to hear from Julian Yates, who's professor of English and Material Culture Studies at the University of Delaware. His talk is titled Outside the Arc. And then after Julian's talk, we'll hear from Maggie Chow, who's the David G. Frey Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her paper, The Entropic History of Ice, is or is not from your forthcoming book, but her forthcoming book sounds really wonderful. It's The End of Landscape in 19th Century America, and it will appear next year, so keep your eye out for that. So Julian, would you please join me in welcoming Julian Yates.
Okay, I'm not going to do anything with the water. So I had a change in title. I'm in a slightly strange affect space following Sarah's wonderful, wonderful performance. Just to explain that, it's a sort of, I feel a great kinship with the joyful ambivalence of the ancestral concrete utopia that was just created for us. And I think I'm getting my Munoz and Ernst Bloch right there. And in thinking about this, I got very giddy when I was writing this paper, a bit carried away, in a very joyful way. And it's not an ambivalent paper, however. So thank you, Chris and Rebecca, or thank you to all the various entities that make up the infrastructure of the Clark Institute of Art. Those that have names that I know, those whose names I don't know, and those of you who don't have names at all. Right. Okay, let me just orient myself here. Okay. Oh gosh, this is so posh. Right. So, in his essay, Noah's Ark, originally published in 1987 in the Revue Critique, and then rewritten, augmented over a period of years that witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the First and Second Gulf War, 9/11, and as well as an increasing awareness that anthropogenic climate change is the cause of mass extinction, the global rise in temperatures and sea levels, and the potentially catastrophic interruption of seasonal meteorological norms. Art historian and self-styled displaced philosopher Hubert Damisch asks why it may be that the entry for architecture, written by celebrated architect Jacques-François Blondel in Denis Diderot and Jean de Rand's famous 1751 encyclopedia, is so very short. I think that could be funny. I said it was a strange affect space. Dispatched in just 3 compact and carefully phrased columns, is how Damisch puts it. Blondel does manage a synoptic, if skeletal, architectural history from the Greeks to his contemporaries. He defines architecture as an art of proportion and measure, and so as both art and science. He also distinguishes architecture from the simple art of building, in other words, construction, by insisting that the purview of his entry of architecture itself concerns the art of composing and constructing buildings for the convenience, commodité, and different purposes of life, such as sacred buildings, royal palaces, and private houses, as well as bridges, public squares, theaters, triumphal arches, etc. The word composition, as Damisch comments, is what distinguishes architecture from the simple art of building or construction, as in the case of military or naval architecture. Where, in the encyclopedia then, should readers look for some treatment of construction, or what Blondel refers to as the art of building in relation to matter, as opposed to proportional composition, his apparently preferred key words. The results, initially, prove frustrating. The entry on construction, which runs to more than 20 pages, takes as its subject grammar and grammatical construction, with some reference to geometry. Some information is to be found in the entries on carpentry, masonry, and joinery, but otherwise, says Damisch, the art of building in relation to matter appears to go missing or to be included only as a partially occluded supplement. Damisch acknowledges that the 1777 supplement to the encyclopedia includes 2 further articles on architect and architecture that seem to speak to this omission, but he finds them equally as flat as Blondel's original entry. Perhaps then Blondel's brevity might be the result merely of the constraints imposed on contributors by alphabetical order. But the fact that the entries on art and composition were not used to remedy the problem, offers Damisch, seems to indicate that neither the author nor the editors felt any need to do so. That said, perhaps generations of readers have been looking in the wrong place for further wisdom on the business of construction or the art of building in relation to matter, that Blondel, as Damisch renders him, seems to wish to distinguish from architecture as a science and art of proportion, measure, and perspective. Directly prior to Blondel's entry on architecture, for example, appears an entry on, of all things, naval construction, written not by a shipbuilder or architect, it must be said, but by a theologian, Abbé Edmé François Mallet. Very excitingly, from Damisch's point of view, Mallet manages to produce what looks an awful lot like an authentically functionalist approach to architecture or construction, and one that even goes into details, such as how to construct a space whose use changes over time, a space that must accommodate all manner of beings, feed and water them, and contain their waste and care for them. Readers who look to the encyclopedia and feel frustrated that they find within its contents little discussion of such pressing matters that occupy architects and urban planners today, such as risk management, logistics, accommodation, questions of access and security, or even, the tensile strength of materials, or who conclude that they shall have to wait for the likes of modernism or Le Corbusier to encounter a purely functionalist sense or a purely functional sense of proportion, shall find themselves transported, embarked on a story that might displace their sense of architectural history, alter their conceptions of architecture in relation both to the materials of construction and the urgent matters of catastrophe, human-authored and otherwise. The title of this entry on functionalist architecture, on the art of building in relation to matter, written so many centuries ago, so very many more centuries, in fact, than the date of the encyclopedia, as Abbé Mallet would have been the first to attest, is, of course, Ark. The Genesis account of Noah's Ark, with its divinely given blueprint and imminent weathering of an announced catastrophe, is the first architectural treatise. And a treatise that enables Damisch to recast architecture with its attendant or necessary questions of accommodation and environing, and perhaps even the story of making or poiesis itself, not as the besting of flood, failure, and catastrophe, but quite precisely as finding its origin, its birth, from the waters of a flood. The art of building in relation to materials, he offers, has never ceased to cohabit with the prospect of a generalized catastrophe, which typically either it looks to stave off by rendering it useless, or merely aspires to furnish humanity with the means to survive without too much damage. Calculate the risks, construct the necessary shelter, navigate the storm. But more fundamentally, or occluded by the survivalist or settler narrative, which appears to subtend the more decorous and proportioned art of composing and constructing buildings for convenience and different purposes of life, Damisch invites us to consider the way the story of Noah's Ark might reveal the way architecture itself might stand not in opposition to catastrophe, but as the art of constructive failure. As architecture's status as the privileged domain of application for catastrophe theory seems to confirm. In other words, architecture designates, inhabits, makes its home out of and within the rupture or failure of materials that reach their own individual catastrophe points, and whose several catastrophes it must therefore orchestrate or arrange in what is called building in relation to materials, or what we might now name a whole arc of otherwise than human agents, forces, entities, materials, and ecologies. Although he does not quite say it, Damisch seems to suggest that we should surrender the depleting hope that one day the art of building or making will vanquish risk, failure, catastrophe, and flood. The story of the Ark, as he seems to know, invites something else entirely. something implicit in the fact that the dimensions of the ark or floating building that Noah and his family construct are not of his own design, but are received directly from the divine. God, after all, is the architect, Noah and family, God's builders. What then should we conclude from this co-announcement or double articulation of flood and ark, of inhuman catastrophe and design? Okay. Here, Damisch and Mallet follow the 17th century English theologian Bishop John Wilkins, who famously calculated the minimum dimensions of the ark based on the space and resources he calculated necessary for Noah, his family, and their assembled animals over the course of the voyage. His calculus projected the way arrangements of space inside the ark would alter as the carnivores, and this is his interpretation of the Genesis story, ate their way through the flocks of sheep that served as their food, fodder was used up, and the amount of excrement increased. His calculations are now widely credited as anticipating the mathematics necessary for global trade from the sailing vessels of the East India Company in the 17th century to the circumatlantic slave trade or Middle Passage, and today the integrated networks of container ships and transport links that, among other things, enabled the global trade in industrialized flesh become meat, and which the migrancy of displaced persons and human trafficking networks mimic or parasite. Wilkins explains the divine origin of the ark's dimensions and materials as evidence of the insufficiency of human thought when faced with catastrophe. The human mind, he moans, tends to wildly exaggerate objects. Left to his own devices, Wilkins offers that he feels that Noah and his family would have engendered a building infinitely greater than was necessary, and so which would have failed, listed, sunk, or whose accommodations would have been so errant as to result either in starvation or glut. Damisch reads Wilkins' reserve as evidence of the propensity of modern societies to deal with difficulties they face by excess rather than lack, and to imagine solutions, to devise projects, to impose tasks on themselves, and to fuel dreams of exaggerated scope that are ultimately totalitarian. Accepting, on the contrary, as the story of Noah's Ark offers, that the dimensions of survival emerge with and from catastrophe, and that therefore the arc of catastrophe radicalizes questions of accommodation, of refuge, and survival, signals the way in which, for all its drawing down of boundaries, necro-biopolitical, zoopolitical, or in Elizabeth Povinelli's term, geontological, the ark decides the relations between life and death. It is itself a calculus as to those boundaries. For all its closing, for all the closing of the door of the ark from the outside, it must be said, or the limits of a building, the very structure of the ark and of architecture necessitates and produces an open inquiry into structure and structuration. The ark stands as both the origin and expression, stands both as origin and expression, a zoobiopolitical crux whose actualization decides everything. It has, if you like, a centering function, to think back to some of yesterday's papers, that's keyed also to its mobility. The ark mobilizes centers. Putting the ark back into architecture enables Damisch and us to recognize that catastrophe takes its place at the beginning of the tale, not the end. Architecture, as Diderot and Laurent's alphabetic arrangement of entries apparently registers, could only find its place after the flood, or rather, in its stead. If all architecture thus far in human history has, as Mackenzie Walk has suggested, been architecture of the Holocene, entirely recent time, which is to say, an art of building that could anticipate a predictable set of ecological constraints and conditions within certain limits. And if today, in the epoch of anthropogenic climate change, architecture must somehow come to anticipate an entirely unpredictable set of circumstances and non-generalizable local conditions, then with Damisch, Abbé Mallet, and Bishop Wilkins, I'd like to offer the Genesis story of Noah's Ark as evidence that we can, as a structure, admittedly, as I think of sort of as this image and the sort of history I've sort of adduced to it can testify an ambivalent sort of operation that still can turn into an open text on the question of structure, accommodation, and shelter, that these have essentially always cohabited with the drawing down of boundaries and the decision that the erection of a building entails. So hello. I'm Julian Yates. It's lovely to be here, and I'd like to welcome you to what my friend and collaborator, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, call ark thinking, a consideration of the way the story of Noah's Ark embeds an ongoing set of questions about construction, accommodation, air conditioning, environment, and catastrophe. We're writing a book called Noah's Archive, Groundless Reading from the Beginning Until the End of Time, that examines how stories of world-purging flood enduringly structure the imagination of anthropogenic climate change in its unfolding and the architecture of our responses to it, from ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and fundamentally the Book of Genesis, to contemporary envisionings of sea level rise, especially, but not only, in works of speculative fiction. We linger in the medieval and early modern periods because our contention is that the Genesis story and its various iterations, in all the various stories generated by people of the book, offer a much more nuanced treatment of questions of accommodation than the somewhat routine invocations of the ark as a trope today. Many of the texts, from our point of view, that are generated in the Middle Ages and early modern period that rework the Genesis story, do so in a manner that we might now regard as speculative, even, if you're so inclined as we are, speculative modes of self-insertion, biblical fan fiction. We've prepared a brief montage for you in the spirit of establishing the phenomenon, or actually following Sarah's paper with her invocation of Minoz, cruising it, which is a joyful, ambivalent, sideways glance at Noah and the story. In other words, not cultivating an affect of not quite knowing what to think. You can tell I travel by trope. We've been visiting some, because the Ark project is a living story in the sense that many people are living it still. Brief touch of Canaletto there. Robert showed us this. There's the Ark. Not a Canaletto, but still a differently mediated. I've deeply admired in presenters' papers the use of refusing to show an image at various points. That's something that I found profoundly interesting. So I thought I'd show you some images without me actually discussing them. People are still building arks in so many ways. To speak of strange affects, as Blanchot once wrote, no, the apocalypse always proves disappointing. Okay. So as you can see, one of the things that intrigues us is the way the minimal scaffolding of the Genesis narrative seems to auto-produce or proliferate a series of differing perspectives: life and death inside the ark, the fate of those not wanted on the voyage, life and death upon landfall, life and death for those not on the ark, Positions shift, perspectives are imagined, inhabited, imaged, and scripted as the story is read and crucially remediated and so reanimated by its readers and viewers. Of course, everyone thinks they know what the Ark is. The Ark is a ship in which you place your animals to save them from catastrophe, or a box in which you secure records, stories, sacred objects, and seeds of origin. But few realize the complicated histories from which our modern arks arrive, their strange detours and unexpected remakings. A term conveying refuge and conservation, Ark has traversed troubled waters and long centuries on its journey into the narratives we tell. A space of sanctuary and preservation, an ark is built to convey some fragment of a turbulent present into a better future, although Sonia's arks seem to function in sometimes catastrophically reverse ways in terms of their ability to provoke black crust. We stow in virtual arks sequences of DNA, the frozen ark network, and upload into databases images meant to preserve animal diversity from oblivion, the photo ark. Sometimes we safeguard living creatures within physical structures christened with that name, carefully managing their reproductive habits to delay their extinction, the amphibian ark. Plants and seeds have their own special version of arks, as do, in a way, the wealthy gated communities, bunker chic, and other havens to exclude the tumults of the world. In narratives of climate change, we turn to the ark as a microcosm secured against disaster, a chance to survive the world's end. In our speculative fictions, what was for Noah and his family a boat becomes a spaceship. The book of Genesis has gifted us with the most powerful trope for envisioning how life endures beyond cataclysmic climate change. Noah builds a box-like vessel to sail the rising waters with his cargo of humans and animals, bequeathing to the earth a chance to start over, to be populated anew. The odd-looking modern English word ark denotes primarily this boat that Noah constructed against deluge. Old English erk anglicizes the posh Latin arca, a noun that for writers like Juvenal, Horace, Pliny, and Cicero named a chest for keeping precious things, especially money, safe, enabling them to endure the perturbations of the world. Arca therefore makes certain good sense for designating the vessel, but we will also recognize ark as signifying chest, since the Ten Commandments were stored in a container, which in English translations of the Bible is described as the Ark of the Covenant. After its deployment in the Latin Vulgate translation of the Hebrew Bible, the world filled with arks, arches, archon, arcas. Versions of the Latin term have found their way into numerous contemporary languages, even non-Romance tongues. Arca in turn stretches back in time to the Greek arche, designating beginnings, origins, and the source of civic authority, documents preserved in a strongbox, but also a figure of witness. The word ark is itself quite literally an odd little archive that has been sailing the linguistic sea for millennia. As a chest full of hopes, we continue to connect the term to Noah's device for protecting family, food, and animals. Yet the Hebrew noun that names this cataclysm-enduring craft is tebah, used only one other time in the Torah to designate the basket of reeds preserving the infant Moses. Tebah may have little to do with the ark chests that translation into Latin spawned. The word arcus also gives us the word rainbow, the weapon the divine suspended in the heavens like some sort of inverse or archived sword of Damocles. Arks, whatever they are, how have they gathered their manifold stories, sail divergent currents. When viewed from the centuries, they constitute a divergent flotilla. Every ark is an invitation, an opportunity to reopen the question of structure and origin, of past, present, and future, even as that gesture of reopening comes premised on the drawing down of limits, the closing of a door, and landfall. Materializing spaces of circumscription and confinement, sorting the various and the volatile into fixity, an ark may function as a museum, chancery, seed vault, biosphere, starcraft, zoo, library, factory farm, slave ship, database, repository. Every ark preserves at cost. To engineer such a structure is to perform a gesture of despair and desire at once. Despondency for an earth not to be saved, confidence after disaster abates in a better home to come. Yet that better conveys a narrowness, a drawing down of boundaries, begging the question of better for whom. An ark is not launched in the expectation of a more survival or commodious world for all who dwell upon its lands, before and within catastrophe. Selective and small, its spaces are closed against a cosmic diversity of beings, conserving meager community against general ruin. Arks easily become prisons. Yet entangled within the closing of alternatives every ark attempts, the trajectories it sails will veer unexpectedly, will offer the unbolting of unforeseen possibilities. The same ark that reduces boisterous lives to storable, sortable units and attempts to regulate the plots of the stories it conveys will inevitably open up the imagination. An ark, so it seems, attempts to assert human agency within, upon, and against a world of non-compliant, otherwise than human actors, refusing containment. But as Damisch, Abbé Mallet, and Bishop Wilkins seem to agree, creatures, elements, storms, oceans, climate, toxins, atoms, time, and every other force and object outside the ark environs, pushes back. And with Damisch, we anticipate an architecture that solicits these actors, these otherwise than human actors, that seeks to process the word catastrophe as several, a continual overturning that might alter our sense of structure. To drown beneath a surge is not always to lose story, voice, and agency. Of course, not all arks are mobile. In The Age of Stupid, a 2009 documentary made in anticipation of the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, we meet a family-less Noah in the role of the archivist. He welcomes us to the Global Archive, a repository of pickled specimens of animals, along with all the treasures of the art world and records of human achievement gathered together 800 kilometers north of Norway. You could be forgiven in thinking that this wind-powered building or tower reaching up to the sky epitomizes something closer to an ill-timed, after-the-fact Tower of Babel than an ark. After all, it houses a sort of species-wide retrospective of human making. The pickled animals are also the products of human making. But the purpose of this exhibit now seems unclear, as no visitors enter to queue to enter the museum become mausoleum. But then the story of the Tower of Babel, that story of a human-authored technological superlative that aspires to join all nations and peoples and languages, runs in tandem with the differently timed and patterned story of the flood. Indeed, the figure of this global archive might be said to hybridize the two stories, offering itself as both repository or archive, and also as a communication device that might commute the sins of global climate change. The film unfolds as the archivists attempt to understand how it may be that the human race managed to know what was happening and failed to address it. How could the current circumstance have come to pass? The very texture of the film wrestles with the difficulty posed in recognizing climate change, in taking cognizance again and again and again, and so owning, inhabiting, living in and up to the reality of making, environing, and building within the altered circumstances of anthropogenic climate change, of understanding the ark in architecture. The film's structure juxtaposes the stories of Piers, a clean energy entrepreneur and wind farmer from the United States who, along with Lisa, his wife, and their kids, likes to go skiing in France. Fernand, their 86-year-old guide to the Alps, who lives on the glacier, protests the increase in traffic through the Alps and offers his first-hand testimony of how much the glacier has retreated since he was a boy. Jay, heir to a communications fortune in India, who launches India's third budget airline. Alvin, a chemist for oil companies off the coast of Florida, who experienced Katrina firsthand, becoming something of a local hero because he ferried their friends, neighbors, acquaintances, strangers, along with their pets and potted plants, to higher ground in time of flood. Laefa, who works to become a doctor as she and her family scrape by in Nigeria in an economy decimated by big oil and a community terrorized by violence. Adnan and Jamila, children in an Iraqi refugee family now living in Jordan, whose father was killed by US soldiers. The archivist summons up these stories as he searches the Global Archive for references to climate change in 2009, the year that might have counted, summoning up a succession of screens in the ark or tower, become media ecology that that enables him and us to perceive the interpenetration and so relatedness of stories, localities, and sites. We have the juxtapositions of images and video. This retrospective solo or media ecology enables the synoptic God trick, or I want to say, thank you, Verity oikosis, that makes recognition possible, even as I think that recognition in the case of this film is complicated. Although already in 2009, and especially now, given that we have passed the projected tipping point of 2011, this ecology proves solipsistic. The film periodically returns to images of Fernand's little roped party of glacier walkers that includes peers and family as an image of the social, or sociality as the linkages between persons, animals, and plants, and conditions that appear unrelated at a distance. The roped party is, of course, the privileged icon of our condition in Michel Serres' The Natural Contract. But even as the film aspires by the interlacing of images and stories and places to produce the praxis of the roped party, recruiting its viewers to reduce their emissions and lobby on behalf of carbon taxes or credits come Copenhagen, the retrospective cast to its 2055 inquiry proves at best salutary. So why did I build this archive? Asks the archivist as the film nears its apocalypse. It's a cautionary tale, he offers from his eerie, in what now seems to have become a last man scenario and extinction narrative. It is now that the archivist reveals the true purpose of his ark or tower. A few touches on the screen that frames his face sends the message on its way, and the ark or tower broadcasts the records of his search, or perhaps the entirety of the archive of human making skyward, addressing whatever unknown beings might one day receive it. The radio wave is pictured as a flash of white light, a blinding techno-magical broadcast to the beyond that renders sublime the banal inability of the movie's mixed media imaging to render recognition of anthropogenic climate change an owned and enacted efficacy. How could we not act? We were living, so it turns out, not in the Anthropocene, the Plantationocene, the Capitalocene, or even the Thulacene, or any of the other newly available names for our epoch, but as Alvin the oil worker remarks, in the age of stupid. Like the makers of the documentary, we subscribe to the necessity of mixed media, to a promiscuity of story, time, and place in the hopes of some future efficacy grounded in the making kin of our present. It's the last man narrative that gives us pause. It's the loading of the ark with pickled animals and buried treasures we resist. Ark thinking demands more. Ark thinking already arrives crowded with differently timed historical persons and places who, by their encounter with the story of the flood, have offered themselves as the wetware of ecological thought. Everyone who builds and boards an ark, whether they identify themselves as a Noah or if they enter unwillingly, is merely the latest and newest inhabitant to the story or in plotting of architecture and catastrophe. There's a lot more, obviously, that I would want to say. In fact, I can feel it welling up inside me, a flood of arcs that contribute to this arc thinking or attempt like Damisch not to make concepts, as Gilles Deleuze writes, as the function of philosophy, so much as to displace them, to own and inhabit and motivate all that the arc appears to decide. I'd like, for example, to tell you about the Noah-less flood in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, to dwell with so many of the images I have shown you, even and especially the Playmobil ark. It comes in 3 sizes and suits all ages and epochs. I'd like also to introduce you to Joel, the little boy the artist Ellen O'Grady remembers from childhood in her book of words and images Outside the Ark, An Artist's Travels in Occupied Palestine, who, when read the story of Noah's Ark aloud, and then shown the picture in the book of the sturdy, gleaming ark surrounded after the flood by the lush green trees and colorful plants, all under the beautiful rainbow in the sky, suddenly yelled, "Where are all the bodies?" Mrs. Graff, their teacher, calls him a very rude boy. Landfall and Rainbow failed to entrance this Joel, this resistant reader whose world is not to be contained within a finalizing rainbow. A boy whose name literally, ironically, affirms that God is God. Yoel signifies Yahweh is God. He refuses to be transported. Or more correctly, there is something to the telling of this story, something to Mrs. Graff's well-intentioned reading aloud and then bad behavior that transports only too well, that works upon the imaginative faculties of the little boy such that when she turns the book around, holds it open to the picture of the sturdy gleaming ark surrounded after the flood by lush green trees and colorful plants, rainbow in the sky, the transfer from the time-bound linearity of words in their telling to the synoptic image of landfall appalls. The reduction of the telling, which provokes a succession of nightmare images, to the good news of landfall provokes his grief, his outrage, his lament, and his question, where are all the bodies? Sometimes the flood occasioned by an ark is a flood of affect, a flood of anger. Joel, who indeed affirms and attends, objects. The flood comes to register instead as an attack, not on the outrageous, the so-called unrighteous, but on the very human ambient thing without which people cannot remain people. A primordial act of environmental terror that uses violence against the very air that groups breathe. The air, the atmosphere, the primary media for life. News of the flood, narrating the flood, sometimes produces a compensatory outpouring of affect, of feeling, a reciprocal movement or flow of energy that seeks to recognize, remark, buoy, or even to revive all that has been lost. We sit open-mouthed. We breathe. Then comes the noise, the anguish and the anger, the air in our lungs, a medium that animates this loss, this terror, this outrage. I'm flooded with the desire to keep talking to you and to show you so many things, but time grows short. Outside it stopped raining. It's time to make landfall. Arc thinking and its flotillas demand an interpretive practice that we've been calling groundless reading, an interpretive trajectory that circles around and intermingles disjunct perspectives without stabilizing context into secure meaning. Groundless reading explores the transhistorical vectors of the Noah story to drift with the elements of the narrative that cannot be constrained by the anchoring particularities of time and place. It is, I think, for me at least, in Dylan's sense, a living story, a story that, anyway. Although not anti-historicist, this mode of reading is at least more than historicist, in that it includes the excess that historicism seeks to reduce. Groundless reading refuses to assume only the point of view of the characters within the driving or main plot of the narrative, the authority figures who keep their intended storylines and pasts and futures locked in watertight archives. It refuses the pre-given narrative arc of the ark, or prefers to notice and to note the way in which, while Noah stories are so often about origins, nothing is all that original about them. Groundless reading in general prefers the company of those excluded from the ark, Mrs. Noah, who sometimes has to be manhandled aboard, who does not generally get to speak, the ravens and doves and the peacocks and the recalcitrant lions, and maybe even the gopher wood of the naval timber that populate this ark. I mean, we all get on as vegetarians, able to talk to one another, and we sort of humans essentially come off as wolves. As a mode of textual and cultural analysis, groundless reading follows the most imaginative vectors of the story, sometimes even going overboard to dwell with sea creatures who make their homes in the drowned cities now open to wandering, which is a very, very intensely imagined trope. As an interpretive ethics, groundless reading makes kin with the drowned, or follows the wayward trajectories of the hungry raven away from the security of the ark and home. It's extra or extro-diegetic. By way of an ending, let me say, as perhaps you've already realized, that groundless reading is immersive. I'm really out of my depth. Against what Donna Haraway has called the God trick, which pretends that the truth is to be discerned from above, from an abstract and disembodied perspective that privileges distance and detachment, groundless reading strives for saturated and embodied ways of knowing. Groundless reading is inundated, engulfed, turbulent, submerged, activist. It's not anchored in history, not anchored in protagonists, not anchored in some distant, outside, or detached perspective or in any single medium. Because it moves through air and water and stone and fire, because it is not willingly immured or immobilized, it means recognizing and embracing errant trajectories as we attempt to hold open the architecture of the ark, to widen the temporary refuge that arks have to offer, as we surrender to the multiple catastrophes in whose stead, as Damish has taught me, the ark in architecture emerges. So thank you. Jeffrey wants me to show you this last image, but I feel very ambivalent about it, okay? It's a sort of alternate, tropic ending of the story. It's a bit overly reparative for me, especially since, as the patristics would have it, the rainbow is it's a medium-specific promise. It merely lets you know that the world's not going to be wiped out by water again. The coming apocalypse will be of fire. So the rainbow is a suspended weapon. It's a sort of figure of deterrence. Okay, thank you very much. Can I just leave I usually leave my glasses case up here around about now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking around to the last session. So I just want to, as with all the speakers, really want to thank Chris and Rebecca for convening this group and for including me in this conversation. And also thank you to Laura and Ashton and all the staff here for really making this visit such a pleasure. So hopefully I will add to this conversation about flow by giving you some thoughts about other kinds of journeys. Let's see, it's not how you do it. All right. In this recent work called The Distance Between What We Have and What We Want, Arctic Ice Project, the New York-based Bahamian artist Tavares Strachan harvested a 4.5-ton block of ice from Alaska and sent it by FedEx to his native Nassau, where it was kept frozen through a hot summer in a solar-powered freezer. For Strachan, ice is a powerful medium with certain sculptural qualities. Thus encased, as you see here, it recalls a minimalist cube behind gallery glass. Yet ice, as we know, is not so much a material as a state, one defined by tenuous chemical bonds, which means that this rigid block is constantly at entropic risk of melting, losing its form, or altogether vanishing. The potential ruination of this particular ice block speaks to both dark futures and troubling pasts. In its aesthetic, sculptural qualities, the artwork gestures towards environmental crisis, a topic often communicated today through images of majestic glaciers and stunning icebergs. This is just one of many recent examples. Indeed, the ecological catastrophes on our horizon have led to a growing global consciousness about the material conditions of ice. We think of it as melting now more than ever. Yet the geographies of Strachan's piece ask us to look not forward but back to our colonial pasts. The ice block's southbound journey inverts the trajectories usually taken by perishable goods in cooled containers, not unlike this one. And the delicate technological equilibrium achieved in Nassau maps the ironic intimacy between the frigid north and torrid south that have long governed our global economy. Although treating ice as medium is a more recent development in the history of art, the recognition of the unique aesthetic power of ice is not. So in my talk today, I want to trace the origins of the technological and commercial conditions thematized in this work, Arctic Ice Project, to an earlier historical moment when ice loomed large, 19th century America, the heyday of Arctic exploration and global shipping. An excursion to this past and back can help us, I think, better understand the nexus of environmental and political imperialisms that have long oriented our fantasies and nightmares of entropy. In the summer of 1859, the American landscape painter Frederick Church and the art writer Louise LeGrand Noble set out on a voyage after icebergs. Their destination was the icy bays of Labrador and Newfoundland, where, as Noble later explained in this rather opulently written chronicle, icebergs and the facilities for studying them and sketching them abound. Upon their return, Church undertook to paint his mammoth 1861 canvas, The Icebergs, a panoramic rendering of a watery cove framed by towering cliffs, tunnels, shelves, all of shimmering ice. Church and Noble were among the many 19th century Americans who ventured north to examine the continent's icebound regions. Mass culture and enthusiasm for the Arctic had by then reached a fever pitch in the wake of many well-publicized commercial and scientific expeditions. The explorer Elisha Kane's memoir, for instance, of the Second Grinnell expedition, which took place in 1855, was said to have joined the Bible on every parlor table in America. The enterprising Church, no doubt, aimed to create the next Arctic masterpiece. He had just completed this colossal South American landscape, the heart of the Andes. It was then, during his time in the Arctic, it was on a national tour on which it quickly became the most popular display of a single artwork in the Civil War era. Although Church executed his Arctic masterpiece with the same signature features of dramatic topography and richly delineated detail, these things were what made him such a famous artist at the time, the work only confounded American viewers. While it's hard for us, modern viewers, not to marvel or perhaps cringe, whatever your taste is, at this painting's excess, those blindingly turquoise glowing caves and endlessly glimmering bluffs and spires, period critics were troubled by this picture's blankness and formlessness. "One hardly knows what to say about it," said a critic. "It is difficult to realize that the painting is actually a representation of nature." Another noted that the scene resembles, quote, "the day of creation when the earth was without form and void." So with so much to look at, why is it that so many found nothing to see? Such critical assessments reflected visual encounters with the Arctic more generally during this period. Another artist of frozen landscapes, William Bradford, when he returned from a 3-month voyage to Greenland, he similarly told accounts of visual shock that we can relate to the reception of Church's icebergs. Bradford describes bays filled with, quote, "wild, rugged shapes, indescribable and ever-changing, that baffle all description." Ice, he concluded, could be bewildering in the infinite variety of its sameness. For sure, the optical ambiguities of the frozen world have long destabilized aesthetic and geographic certainties, and Chris has written about this in an early modern context. But I want to suggest that in 19th century America, the perceptual paradoxes associated with Arctic encounter were particularly politicized. The fervor for all things Arctic coincided at this time with an economic globalization that demarcated temperate north and torrid south, and along with it, cold and hot matter. When the aforementioned William Bradford, who you see here, a New Englander specializing in Arctic scenery, painted works like his 1871 An Arctic Summer, he underscored the fact that icescapes were a subject with global reach. With the inclusion of a tall ship boring through the pack, as the subtitle tells us here, Bradford capitalized on an international scientific obsession of his day, the hunt for the fabled Northwest Passage, the shortest route between Euro-American ports and trade destinations in East and South East and South Asia. Thus, breaking through Arctic ice, which this ship is poised to do, meant clearing a route to the tropics. Looking north meant thinking south. Accounts of a Northwest Passage have circulated since the 16th century, but it was pursued with greatest fervor in the 19th. A new sea route over North America would dramatically reduce cost and time in trans-Pacific shipping, which then required sailors to round Cape Horn in the tip of South America. The British were the most ambitious of the Arctic explorers in the first half of the 19th century, followed by the Americans in the latter half. Between 1850 and 1910, more than 24 American expeditions entered the Arctic Circle, many under the guise of humanitarianism, to rescue the celebrated British explorer, Sir John Franklin, and his crew, who had been lost since 1845 while in hot pursuit of the same seafaring route that his American rescuers were ultimately after. Summing up the Anglo-American tradition of Arctic exploration in 1871, Matthew Maury, the author of Physical Geography of the Sea, the standard oceanography text of the period, observed, quote, "Whatever may have been the immediate object of these various expeditions, whether to enlarge the fields of commerce, to carry the Bible, to spread civilization, to push conquest, or to bring back contributions to science, it has never lost sight of the promise made by Columbus of a western route to India." The possibility of a Northwest Passage structured 19th century understandings of the Arctic's relationship to the rest of the globe. Here we have, I should have shown this earlier, it's a map of the Northwest Passage. Dreams of global connectedness, sans ice, emerged in all aspects of culture. In 1826, John Cleves Sims, a trader living in the then frontier city of St. Louis, so he's a man who is very familiar with commerce across distances, published a book proposing that a hollow inner earth connected the two poles. If you went far enough northward, he theorized, you would be transported to the other side of the earth. Though outlandish, Sims's hollow earth theory generated considerable popular press attention and was even cited as the primary motivation of a government-funded expedition to the South Pole. Meanwhile, a network of geographers theorized that a warm, open sea flowed over the Earth's poles just beyond the subarctic regions. The idea that also surfaced in literary accounts, such as Edgar Allan Poe's description of the Antarctic in his 1838 novel, Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, in which a Nantucket sailor encounters steamy, milky currents and white, ashen rain at the southern pole. Although the open sea was largely maritime mythology then, it made the Northwest Passage seem within reach. So by the 1850s, as new scientific studies were done on animal migration, deep water currents, and high atmosphere airflows, showing that those systems connected the poles and tropics, the new scientific knowledge was marshaled to prove the existence of more hospitable climes just beyond the ice-jammed seas that time and again had forced explorers to retreat. In claiming that these warm flows made the frozen north navigable, scientists neatly tied the Arctic to the tropics in a scientific defense of economic ambitions. It is no coincidence that the global shipping of perishable commodities dates back to these most self-assured decades of Arctic exploration. As Church and Bradford painted the Arctic, the American ice industry was booming. Large-scale harvesters hacked blocks of ice out of frozen rivers and lakes throughout the Northeast to literally supply the tropics with cold. As the historian of science Rebecca Woods has argued, cold, when harnessed as a technology and a commodity, cheats both time and distance, connecting the food chains of North and South, temperate zones and tropical latitudes, metropoles, with rural metropoles with rural and colonial outposts. It was with the commodification of ice that the tropics became the lifeline of our modern way of life. In the early to mid-19th century US, cold technologies revolved around the management of the material conditions of ice. Ice may have been a renewable resource acquired at no cost, but early entrepreneurs were well aware of its entropic properties. A pioneer in the ice trade, Frederick Tudor, aka the Ice King, blamed his initial failures on the absence of environmental controls in his system. Only after investing in cargo hold insulation and storage depots, in other words, an infrastructure and technology for keeping ice frozen, did he meet financial success. By the 1820s, ice had become an international commodity shipped as far as China and India. American ice companies imagined the global reach of their product from the outset, identifying the Caribbean as their key market. Tudor's first business venture, in fact, involved shipping a cargo of ice to Martinique, and unfortunately, it did not really survive the journey. And then he shifted his focus to establishing a monopoly in Havana with this kind of infrastructure that he understood he needed to create. In a draft business plan, he offered investors assurance of the company's, quote, advance in extending service to all the tropical places. Arctic ice and commodity ice, in many ways, were one and the same. In the 19th century, both their geographies were bidirectional, linking frozen north and tropical south. In the metropolitan Northeast, cities like New York and Boston, where Church and Bradford were exhibiting their Arctic landscapes, viewers likely connected the otherworldly scenery pictured in their canvases with the commodity harvested from their local rivers and ponds. In Noble's account of Church's expedition, sea ice in Labrador is described as akin to, quote, our summer cakes handed in by the Iceman. Meanwhile, accounts of industrial ice trading evoke the landscapes of the Arctic. In an article about the harvesting industry and its technology, the Journal of the Franklin Institute described one innovator in the trade as, quote, the great transporter of icebergs to the torrid regions. And one did literally serve as the other in that seafarers during this time regularly would harvest ice when they were in the Arctic region for their journeys to warmer climates. The irony in these 19th century encounters is that the commodification of winter ice enabled the very transnational connectedness that polar ice geographically hindered. Both quests for a more efficient global commodity circulation were attempts in environmental and material control. One icing, the other de-icing, if you will. And neither of these ambitions proved easy to realize. Explorers and mercantilists underestimated the material assertiveness of ice itself, that in melting it speeds decay, and that in freezing it entraps and kills. It took many trials before the so-called Ice King mastered the transportation of perishable goods in cargo holds. It turned out that 1/3 of the hold had to be filled with ice that slowly melted over the course of the time it took to get between Boston and the Caribbean. On the what we might call antifreeze front, 19th century American expeditions found neither a warm polar sea nor Sir John Franklin's ships safe and sound. They returned instead only with rumors of the lost crew's resort to cannibalism, the most dreaded and conceivable in maritime culture. And in fact, Franklin's ships were only discovered just a few years ago, in part due to melting sea ice in northern Canada. By the opening of the next century, Arctic exploration had shifted from searching for open routes to conquering the magnetic poles, and ice harvesting had been replaced by chemically based compressed air refrigeration. And with that, the era of managing the material conditions of ice would end. But it was precisely the 19th century's preoccupation with managing ice that shaped the way Arctic landscapes were then perceived. Unlike Bradford's paintings of de-icing in action, you might say, Church's icebergs was deemed unmanageable, I think, because it presented matter in a state of variability and volatility without signs of material control. And I should just note that the very small detail of the mast in the foreground was actually added later. In declaring itself a landscape painting, this absence of material control was further compounded, for landscape was the American genre most associated with constructing narratives of industrial advancement tied to nature. Take, for instance, Asher B. Durand's aptly entitled Progress, where figures moving along a winding waterside path from foreground to background, first in wagons, then boats, and finally trains, naturalized a narrative of westward expansion tethered to technological evolution. Paintings like icebergs, though, while mimicking the terrestrial landscape in composition and visual effect, despite mimicking the terrestrial landscape, the genre's conventions were incompatible with the material qualities of ice. As one astute critic of Church's icebergs noted, quote, "In painting a scene where only water in its various forms is represented, many of the ordinary rules of painting are reversed." Icescapes, after all, offered neither the stable vista nor the solidity underfoot on which imagined possession and conquest narratives relied. And ultimately, it is not ice, but its absence, de-icing, that would have constituted progress when it came to conquest of the far north. So to make sense of ice, to tether it to cultural ambitions, 19th century artists and writers drew upon its resemblance to more solid terrestrial materials. As if to compensate for Church's mute renderings, and here I'm showing you some sketches that he did of icebergs, Noble, his companion, compared icebergs to castle, mosque, Parthenon, and cathedral, replete with minarets, domes, and steeples. Noble's analogies, which glutted his text, and I'll spare you from reading it all, rely on chance resemblance of ice to other things, a seeing in, that is, an imaginative or associational mode of perception dating back to antiquity and most often applied to immaterial substances such as clouds or smoke. In the 19th century, this mode of perception was not aligned with landscape painting, a pursuit associated with empirical vision and concrete details, but with the then popular art form of ideal sculpture, neoclassical marble figures depicting literary, historical, and mythical subjects. 19th century Arctic narratives regularly evoked connections between ice and sculpture, highlighting the chromatic and textural affinities between marble and frozen water. Bradford, for instance, described icebergs rising from the sea as, quote, "perfectly smooth and white as the purest marble, well proportioned, and as finely rounded by the action of water as if fashioned by the chisel of a sculptor." Furthermore, the discourse of chance perception, so pervasive in Arctic narratives, modeled a mode of vision specifically associated with the encounter with sculpture. And this is not specifically 19th century because we also know that Michelangelo, for instance, was thought of as someone who could see figures emerging from marble. But in 19th century America, exhibition pamphlets and etiquette manuals codified sculptural sight as an associational practice, a kind of seeing in that, as Joy Casson has argued, facilitated a viewer's access to an artwork's allegorical meaning. Instructing viewers on proper behavior before this work, Edward Brackett's Shipwrecked Mother and Child, circa 1850 piece about maritime disaster, the sculptor Horatio Greenough suggests the following, and I quote him: "Sit silently on several sides of the room, and then from even there survey it with half-closed eyes. The work is of marble. It is vain that you will seek aught else by crowding upon it. By remaining at a proper distance, you will find that it is no longer marble, but poetry," unquote. So in other words, to see beyond the meaningless stony surface, the viewer had to purposely reduce his or her visual acuity. This meant that viewers of ideal sculpture used exactly the opposite skills that they would have needed for looking at landscape painting. Spectators of landscape were instructed not to look from afar, but to approach the canvas. And Frederick Church, in fact, encouraged viewers to bring their opera glasses to his exhibitions to facilitate this up-close scrutiny. 19th century accounts of the Arctic, which so indulged seeing in, imaginative associations, chance perception, evoked not the meticulous inspection of landscapes, but the passive gaze of that associated with sculpture. To see ice as sculpted marble rather than frozen water entangled the Arctic in sculpture's racial ideologies. 19th century American sculptors invested heavily in marble's natural whiteness because it facilitated the sublimation of a sensual flesh that may curtail a work's allegorical meaning. As Charmaine Nelson has shown, the rejection of color by neoclassical sculptors followed a colonial logic, pitting the pure, restrained, noble white body against the sensuous, unruly black body, which was rarely a subject of ideal sculpture even after emancipation. Seeing with half-closed eyes also favored marble's intangible whiteness, a smooth flawlessness that pushed sculpture towards poetic abstraction rather than coarse materiality. Indeed, one of the most famous marble sculptor of the 19th century, Hiram Power's Greek Slave, toured the antebellum South, it was almost universally praised for its portrayal of ideal femininity rather than read as a critique of the institution of slavery, which it regularly was by Northern abolitionists. Likewise, to see icebergs from afar as marble palaces was also to sublimate the racial implications of ice into the aesthetics of smooth, shimmering surfaces. As a commodity, ice was a luxury good intended for white populations of tropical locales. The American ice industry's largest international markets were colonial outposts with significant Euro-American populations, the Caribbean and India. To set up a successful ice business, one Boston entrepreneur spent time visiting local governments on a dozen Caribbean islands, seeking what he called exclusive rights to sell only to foreign residents. Ice was racialized matter. Associated with the far north, it was seen as incompatible or unfit for those native to tropical climes. This print, showing ice being unloaded in Cuba from the holds of a ship marked Maine, features black enslaved laborers unable to tolerate the extreme temperatures of the imported product. The food historian Hi'ile Hobart, who studies the introduction of ice to 19th century Hawaii, has argued that indigenous accounts of ice as burning or too hot rather than freezing or cold was interpreted by colonists as a marker of biological racial differences. And here we might then try to connect economic consumption and its associated exploitations with physical ingestion, since ice was part of a luxury good associated with refreshments. So to connect these, so we can think about connecting the one kind of consumption with physical ingestion, the other kind of consumption, and the bodies implicated in each. In the 19th century Americas, then, ice, art, and race were inextricably bound together by practices of perception and technologies of globalization. Yet it was only in the 1960s and later that artists, particularly those from the Caribbean and Latin America, have tackled this nexus critically, utilizing the material conditions of ice and its connection to sculpture to critique racial ideologies of globalization. Among the first to work in these terms was the Puerto Rican-born Rafael Ferrer, whose melting environments, constructed of large ice blocks, first at Whitney and then later at MoMA, ironically reenacted the white male heroism of minimalism. Recalling his Puerto Rican upbringing, Ferrer explains that he chose to work with ice because, quote, a man from the tropics views ice as a magical substance, perhaps referencing Gabriel Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, in which a character mistakes ice for the largest diamond in the world. It is precisely the incommensurability of ice and the quote-unquote man from the tropics, the racist ideology animating 19th century global encounters, that gets retooled here by Ferrer and also by other contemporary artists. In his 1997 performance, Paradox of Praxis, the Belgian-born Mexico-based Francis Alice connected ice to non-white labor in the global South. In his piece, Alice physically pushed a torso-sized block of ice through the streets of Mexico City until it had completely melted into the hot asphalt. As a commentary on production and consumption, the artist's grueling but pointless task links the production of cold to the labor of Mexican street vendors, whom Alice also documented in other media during the same period. And more recently, the Brazilian artist Nelly Azevedo has literally used ice to sculpt the bodies of the oppressed. Her minimalist monument, first installed in Brazil in 2005, consists of an army of miniature human figures cast in ice and designed to melt in public urban spaces over the course of 20 minutes. Conceived as anti-monument, Azevedo uses the drama of melting to critique the disconnection between monumental sculpture and local history. Sculpting ice for these contemporary artists who are looking to or from the tropics is ultimately about using ice as a kind of anti-sculpture. The minimalist cube and the civic monument of today, much like the marble goddesses of the 19th century, are constructed from hard, durable matter that speaks to perpetuity and to the maintenance of essentializing narratives. To create them in ice is to marshal entropy as a weapon against the legacies of imperialism. Today, in the midst of climate change, melting ice has become almost too easy to exploit as artistic material. And I think this is something that Chris gestured to in his introduction yesterday with Eliasson's work in Paris. When Minimalist Monument, this piece here, was installed in Berlin in 2009 under the auspices of the World Wildlife Fund, Azevedo's melting bodies were recast as an emblem of global warming, although the artist has never explicitly defined her work in environmental terms. This rebranding of frozen water as stand-in for glacier and iceberg unfortunately erases an important history that in the 19th century as today, the properties of ice bound ecological fragility to racial politics. Now, as melting ice is slowly turning the once mythical open polar sea into a troubling reality, we need to look south as much as north. As the tropics get closer than ever in nautical miles, they also become the region of the world most vulnerable to rising sea levels and warming temperatures. Entropy, then, can be dangerously universalizing. So to end, I thought I would try to reread the piece with which I started my talk today, Strachan's Arctic Ice Project, as an artwork about freezing rather than melting. If we reverse our thinking, the work might be understood as a rescue mission, wherein the non-white explorer from the tropics masters the Arctic. He excavates its most precious matter and preserves it by using cooling technology powered by heat itself. We might say that the piece conveniently realizes the very material control that drove once failed 19th century encounters with ice. But with its revised agents and sites, we can begin to situate today's ecological concerns of melting in a politicized history of freezing. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. Those were really fantastic talks. Maybe I will usurp the privilege and ask the first question, which is, I guess, a pseudomorphosis question, which has to do with the fact that both talks featured images of, let's say in your talk, Julian, the Ark as a container ship, right? This unit of protective integrity that's actually broken down into all of these other units, and some of the images were even grid-like. And it felt that even the encyclopedia that you started with had that kind of quality of, let's say, totality and universality through small units. And Maggie, especially in the middle of your talk, the grid of ice sort of being broken and perhaps entropically distributed across the globe, and yet that being also the site of entropic resistance to decay and degradation. So I guess, yeah, I just was struck by the visual similarities of those two, and I wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
I can go first, I can go second, I don't mind. Okay, thank you. First, just off the top of my head, right, a long history of the word theatre in relation to the word encyclopedia in terms of system and performance would actually turn them into synonyms. They would cross over. I mean, Will West's book on theatre encyclopedia, right, as you know, does that really sort of interestingly for early modernity, so that there's that aspect to that, in that sort of that crossing right there. The question of accommodation in terms of the inside of the Ark, because the inside of the Ark is this theoretical space that, as it's both programmed but not imagined, becomes an issue of design. And one of the things that Wilkins does is to think about variable spaces within it. But that is also, I mean, in other words, there's that question of accommodation is very neutral, right? There's a kind of profound neutrality to it, in the sense that what it permits on the one hand would be the notion of storable and stackable minimal units of being, which could be profoundly enabling or could be profoundly lethal. And so that there's a kind of real tension, I think, in that set of operations in terms of what the Ark story sets in motion as a kind of incomplete project that then has to be then sort of, if you choose to imagine it and inhabit it and retell it, realize, perform, actualize. It's an act of several decisions, which, you know, and the word decision has a madness to it, and it's also all about cutting, right? It literally means to cut.
I really like your question. I hadn't really thought about that, but actually I think I will use Julian's paper to answer my question, which is that I think one of the things that this visual, the visual grid draws to mind is the kind of tension between a matter as raw material and matter as a mode of control, of imperial control. And I think of the Ark, your idea of the archive as really resonant here, because archives are really all about kind of controlling the unruly chaos of stuff. And to some extent, this kind of ambition in the 19th century to control ice materially is about treating it as a kind of, one, to cut it up and into this raw material that's really equivalent, and then also to think about it resonates with the idea of imperial control.
Are there questions in the audience? Yes. Run.
I rushed to ask a question. Your final image, Julian, really resonated with me, because one of my favorite songs as a child by the now disgraced Rolf Harris was all about what happened to the unicorns during the flood, and how they were too busy playing in the water, right. So they didn't get onto the Ark in time, and they all drowned. It used to make me cry. But in relation to what I really wanted to ask about was this idea of a more immersive reading that you came to towards the end of your paper. And I wondered, in that that's an ethical move and an aesthetic move, how does it relate to this idea of surface reading, which people have been talking a lot about recently? Is it in part a response to that?
No. I will say, I mean, I will, okay. I will confess not to having paid sufficient attention to the notion of surface reading or distance reading, as I perhaps should say I should. Can I make that any? I could stop there. So unfamiliar with the work as I am, doing a quick Susan Sontag here. No, I mean, no, not really, and I don't think so. I think those are interesting sort of operations that have a particular kind of interest to them. I was sort of trained as a narratologist in part, so one of the things that I think and this is I see as something that's been sort of in tension throughout the conference for me, and that's sort of the way in which a kind of post-critical type of reading might be identified as immersive or reparative or even curatorial, and a tension with what it means to then kind of retain an element of criticality that gets aligned with a historicizing of particular tropes, authors. And I think that's a tension that I really want to try and keep in play. And that would be a sort of reading that I would offer if, say, something like Bruno Latour's critique has run out of steam. That there's a moment in a life cycle of an idea when critique is needed, but it's not an end in itself. And so there's this kind of cyclical, and cruising, Sarah would give us a different kind of, I don't know where Sarah went. All right, okay, sorry, hi Sarah. A different kind of way of approaching an object, approaching a text, approaching a position with a degree of ambivalence, but an openness to the joy, as difficult as what it might mean to try and own that. So immersive is, there's a certain naivete, right? A kind of studious naivete and a simultaneous sort of, you don't get to outrun the arc. You don't get to outrun the afterlife of the arc and its various landings, and in doing that. So I mean, yeah, I think that's all I'll say. But yeah, and I mean, sorry. The one thing I was saying, there was a certain facetious delight in producing an element of groundless reading, because people could tell me your reading is groundless.
Thanks. Yeah, people can hear me, right? Yeah. Julian, thank you. I wanted to piggyback on that last question and ask about your use of the notion of embodiment and being inundated, immersed in this process of groundless reading, and ask in a way that's aligned with or related to that question of critical positioning, also just situatedness. What is this embody that is experiencing embodiness in reading? It is in a place and it is in a time, and how you keep that notion of embodiment not to avoid it becoming this universalizing discourse about bodies, in toto, but recognizing the situatedness of that embodiment.
Right. That usually, I mean, to a certain extent, it's a continual ambush. Would be the honest way of doing it. There's a certain element of risk to it, and it's the risk of being outfaced. It's the immediate situation for me giving that paper was having completely flat affect, not feeling up to it, partly because of the wonder of your presentation, right? I mean, that's an immediate honest response. Another one would be going to visit the God's Ark of Safety in Frostburg, Maryland, and having asked the pastor to see if he would be willing to sort of be interviewed, meeting him accidentally, and having to develop a very insecure kind of rapport with him, and encountering the mirroring I was doing, the strangeness of not quite knowing how to stand. So that, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that I'll go back to Haraway here on the discourse of species in a weird way, in the sense that there's a tension between particularity and universal and sort of the notion of universal in the discourse of species. In other words, there's a sort of have we got through a particular inventorying of particularities to do with this iteration of a being a species? Is it actually, can we do that? So there's something of a catachresis to that sort of, in other words, it's not a valid reference. And so there's a certain element of being outfaced, of being linguistically challenged. There are certain languages that I know very well in this, and other languages where I get on the phone and ask, so how do you say Tiba? So that not to murder it. So that there's in very small ways, right? In other words, that are variously performed and variously concealed in modes of presentation. I mean, that's a quick, very real answer. I know that groundless reading might seem like a kind of universalizing sort of gesture, and I'll hang out with that.
Chris. No, okay, you're in charge. You do your thing.
Is it me? No. Yeah. Okay. Yes, thank you for these both of these papers, and I have one short remark and one question. The remark is to Julian, your paper. If I'm not wrong, then the ark as a kind of concept and model for, on one side, this taxonomic obsession in European sciences, on the other side of the idea of keeping something by enclosing it, and the idea of the archive. There's another link, a concrete link to the early history of museology. For example, Konrad Gessner and Kentman called their first, as far as I know, first cabinet showcase for fossils and other minerals was called an ark, and also the first, as far as I know, the first, in a certain sense, public museum in London, John Trudascan was called the Ark of Lambeth, and it was explicitly open even for women and children for little salaries. So that's the first case of a public museum we know. So that seems to be a kind of dialectic between enclosing for keeping and showing. At the same time, even in this early history of the 17th century, that's just one thing I had in mind when I heard the paper.
Thank you.
And the question is to seeing these wonderful pictures from the ice world. I have in mind a kind of short period of European tradition in painting. For example, of course, these Caspar David Friedrich's Ice Mare is one of the most well-known, I think, but also other examples. And my question is, in this European iconography of the ice and ice landscapes or icescapes, there is a pessimistic political undertone in that. By Friedrich, it is the era after the Napoleon Wars, and when all high hopes in a kind of new era in European, especially German history failed, then it was that's one background for this iconography. In the 60s, 70s, we have icescapes where shipwrecks were also in the middle of the landscape, and wild boars, these white boars, no, bears. Sorry, the wild beast cheese. What are that? These bears, polar bears. Yes, thank you. Polar bears. They take over the scene, and so that's and somehow a reaction on the Darwinistic idea of evolution and what it could mean to the perspectives of human history if it is not kind of teleological perspective or center point of a theological perspective, but the whole thing could be otherwise. So then, do you see any such undertones also in this American tradition you are studying, or do you think it is completely other things implied into that?
That's a good question, and also a nice connection to make, because of course there is a longer tradition of images of ice in other forms, particularly kind of Mount Alpine and all of that. So yeah, I don't think it's, I mean, I think there is a certain undertone of that, because in fact, German Romanticism does influence American representations of the landscape in general. But in terms of the Arctic, it's hard to say whether that is really essential to those paintings, because they were so wrapped up in the context of exploration, and that in fact I don't think that would have even been a subject that people really wanted to see outside of that context, because the 19th century, the expedition was really so central to the way that Americans understood landscape in general, and particularly the Arctic.
One more question or no more questions? Okay, that's it. I'm sorry. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
We have a sort of unusual event that's going to be the close of this symposium, and we're going to take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, the speakers in pairs are going to come up and do 3-minute performances in closing. So we're going to have 8 3-minute performances. I'm going to set a timer so because you really have to be out of here by 5:30. So really just take 5 minutes, come back, and we'll do like rapid fire, quick takes, performative or conversational, but quick on the events of the past 3 days. Yeah, thank you.